Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. That summer, when Jake invited me to his family's cabin by Lake Tahoe, I thought it would be nothing more than an ordinary getaway, swimming, grilling, lounging on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. We had been best friends since high school, spending countless summers riding bikes through town, messing around on the basketball court. And now, on the verge of college, we just wanted a few days to relax before stepping into this next chapter of our lives. Jake's family cabin sat right by the lake, secluded from the noise of the city, surrounded by tall pines and the endless stretch of deep blue water. As soon as our car crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway, we jumped out, grabbing our suitcases and bags of snacks from the trunk. I was still fumbling with the fishing rods Jake had insisted on bringing when a deep, familiar voice called out from the porch, "You boys finally made it." I looked up to see Mr. Daniel, Jake's father, leaning against the porch railing, a beer in one hand, the other casually waving. He wasn't wearing a shirt, only a pair of khaki shorts, his tanned skin glowing under the late afternoon sun. At almost 50, he still carried a rugged charm, the kind of effortless confidence that made people remember him. I had always admired him, not just because he was laid back and funny, but because of the way he carried himself, calm, strong, the kind of man who never seemed fazed by anything. Jake grinned, hoisting the cooler up the porch steps before playfully slapping his dad's shoulder. "You save us any beer?" Mr. Daniel laughed, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Maybe, but I wouldn't count on it." I chuckled, feeling completely at ease, like I had just walked into my second home. All I expected was a peaceful summer by the lake with my best friend, but I was wrong. I had no idea that this trip would change me forever. The first 3 days passed like a dream, exactly the kind of summer break we had hoped for. Jake and I spent hours swimming in the lake, grilling on the porch, staying up late talking about nothing and everything, then sleeping in, only to wake up and do it all over again. Mr. Daniel was always around, sometimes joining us on the boat rides, sometimes just sitting on the porch with a cold beer, gazing out at the water. He was a part of our world, not distant like some parents, but never overbearing either, just enough to make me feel comfortable in his presence. But then, everything changed. That evening, after dinner on the porch, Jake's phone rang. I could hear Amanda's voice, tense even through the speaker. "I need you to come back as soon as you can. There's a problem at the store. The manager just called, and if someone doesn't handle it, it's gonna be a mess." Jake winced, turning to me apologetically. "Damn it, we planned to stay all week. But she really needs me. You okay if I head back for the night? I'll be back first thing in the morning." I nodded without hesitation. "Go, I'm fine here. Your dad's around anyway." Jake looked relieved, patting my shoulder before turning to his dad. "Keep an eye on Ethan for me. All right?" Mr. Daniel chuckled, his deep voice steady, reassuring. "Don't worry, he'll be just fine." And with that, I stood on the porch, watching Jake's taillights disappear into the forest, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his tires fading into the quiet night. For the first time that week, the cabin felt different, still, almost too still. I could hear everything, the soft lapping of water against the dock, the whisper of wind weaving through the pines, the distant call of a bird somewhere deep in the woods. And then, something shifted inside me. I had been alone with Mr. Daniel before, many times, but this time, it felt different. For some reason, I started noticing things, the way his footsteps echoed inside the house, the deep, unhurried timbre of his voice when he called me down to the kitchen, the way his eyes flickered toward me during conversation before quickly looking away. Without Jake here, everything seemed sharper, closer, or maybe it had always been there, and I was just now realizing it. I tried to enjoy the silence, stripping off my shirt, now clad only in my swim trunks. I dove into the lake one last time before night fully settled in. The cold water wrapped around my skin, offering a brief reprieve from the thoughts circling in my head. I let myself float, eyes closed, body weightless, surrendering to the gentle sway of the water. But when I climbed back onto the dock, soaking wet, breath heavy, my eyes instinctively lifted to the porch. Mr. Daniel was there, standing casually, beer in hand, watching me. Water feel good? His voice was light, but something in his gaze made my pulse stutter. I hesitated for just a fraction of a second before quickly grabbing a towel, running it through my hair, forcing my voice to sound normal. Yeah, it was great. Mr. Daniel gave a small smile, taking a slow sip of his beer before saying, almost offhandedly, the sauna's empty. Feels nice after a swim. I froze for a moment. I had completely forgotten the cabin even had a sauna. It was down by the boathouse, built by Mr. Daniel a few years ago. I'd never really thought about using it before. That does sound nice, I said, my voice coming out a little unsure. My grin forced. I started to turn away. But before I could, Mr. Daniel set his beer down and took a step forward. I'll get it started for you. I wanted to say no, but for some reason, I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I followed him down toward the boathouse, my footsteps suddenly feeling heavier, my heartbeat picking up pace for no reason I could name. Something inside me whispered that this was the moment everything would change. I trailed slowly behind Mr. Daniel, a strange tension creeping into every step. The quiet stillness of Lake Tahoe at night made everything more pronounced. The way droplets of water slid from my hair onto the wooden deck. The sound of my own uneven breathing. The sheer awareness of his presence beside me. I didn't know why my heart was beating so fast. I didn't know why the silence between us felt so thick, so heavy. The sauna sat just off the dock, a small but cozy wooden structure, faintly smelling of pine. As Mr. Daniel pushed the door open and turned on the heat, I suddenly felt a moment of hesitation. I didn't understand why I felt the need to step back, why my instincts screamed at me to pull away. But every inch of my body was tense, a feeling that was equal parts anticipation, discomfort, and something I couldn't quite name. Relax, he said easily, his tone light. It's just a sauna. He looked at me with a calm expression, but there was something in his voice that unsettled me, as if he already knew what I was feeling. As if he understood something about me that I hadn't yet figured out myself. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to act normal, and stepped inside. The heat built quickly, surrounding me, pulling beads of sweat to the surface of my skin. I sat down on one of the wooden benches, eyes trained downward, trying not to think too much. But after a few minutes, the door creaked open again. Mr. Daniel stepped in. This time, he was only wearing a towel around his waist, his tanned skin glistening with sweat under the dim light. I froze. I forced myself not to look, but it was impossible not to notice him. The confidence. The way he carried himself. The way his presence seemed to take up more space than it should. He lowered himself onto the bench across from me, leaning back against the wall, watching me carefully. You seem tense. I flinched, my hands clenching around my knees. The heat suddenly feeling too much. No, I'm fine. He gave a quiet chuckle, shifting forward slightly, his deep voice laced with something unreadable. Saunas are supposed to help you unwind. Ethan, you don't have to be so stiff. I swallowed hard. There was something about the way he looked at me that twisted my stomach into knots. I didn't understand why I felt like this, uneasy, flustered, but not wanting to leave. A bead of sweat slipped down the side of my face, trailing along my jaw. Before I could react, Mr. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against my skin as he wiped it away. The heat's making you dehydrated. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. His touch lasted only a fleeting moment, but it left behind something I couldn't shake off. I could feel his warmth lingering, feel the way his skin transferred heat to mine. And for a second, just 1 second, everything seemed to stop. I quickly turned away, fixing my eyes on the wooden panels of the sauna's walls, trying to come up with a reason to leave. But the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to. What was this feeling? I couldn't name it, but I knew it was growing inside me. When I glanced back at Mr. Daniel, he was still watching me, his gaze unreadable yet piercing, as if he could see right through me. You know, don't you? His words were soft, but they hit me like a crashing wave. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't understand why I felt so drawn to this moment. But there was one thing I did know, I couldn't deny it anymore. I pushed open the sauna door, stepping out into the cool night air. Steam rose from my skin, wisps of heat curling off my shoulders and back as the cold breeze from the lake clashed against my damp skin. My heart was still hammering, whether from the heat or from what had just happened. I wasn't sure anymore. I sucked in a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my lungs still felt tight. The night stretched out before me, Lake Tahoe's dark waters glistening under the moonlight. Still and endless, but my mind was anything but still. I walked toward the porch, my bare feet pressing against the cool wooden planks, the contrast making me shiver. The wind swept past, grazing my skin, sending a ripple of chills down my spine, not just from the cold, but from something stirring deep inside me. I tried to breathe, tried to calm my racing thoughts, but I couldn't stop replaying it. The way he looked at me, the deep timbre of his voice, firm, certain, the way he touched me, so brief, yet impossible to ignore. That wasn't just in my head. It couldn't be. But if it was real, then what did it mean? I didn't want to think about it. But every time I closed my eyes, his sharp, unwavering gaze burned into my mind, like it was chasing me, refusing to let me escape. What the hell am I doing? I'm overthinking this. I had to be. I clenched my hands around the railing, gripping the wood as if grounding myself could erase everything that had just happened. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That strange, twisting feeling in my chest, part unease, part something else entirely, something I didn't want to name. This is Jake's father. This is the man who has treated me like his own son. This is wrong, isn't it? But the worst part, the part that truly terrified me, wasn't the confusion over right or wrong. It was the fact that some part of me didn't want to let go of this feeling. Then, suddenly, a sound behind me. I turned around, and there he was, Mr. Daniel, standing just outside the doorway, a beer in one hand, his fitted tank top clinging to his broad frame. His gaze was unreadable, quiet, knowing. Still awake? His voice was low, smooth, like he already knew the answer. I tried to come up with something reasonable to say, but my throat felt dry, and whatever words I had drowned beneath the weight of the tension between us. Just needed some fresh air. Mr. Daniel stepped closer, leaning against the railing beside me, his eyes never leaving mine. Something on your mind? I swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. No, it's just. I hesitated, forcing the words out, but they betrayed me, slipping from my lips more honest than I intended. It's just, something feels off. I didn't know why I said it, but the moment the words left my mouth, I realized it was the truth. Mr. Daniel studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he smiled, slow, knowing, as if he had been expecting this all along. And what exactly feels off? My grip on the railing tightened, my pulse hammering in my ears. I don't know, but we both knew that was a lie. My breathing was uneven, and I knew, he knew, exactly why. You don't have to say it, he murmured, voice softer now, but still carrying that same quiet certainty. I pressed my lips together, willing myself to look away, but he was still right there, standing close, unwavering. But don't deny it. My breath caught, my chest tightening like I had just stepped off a ledge. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should run or stay, if I should pretend this never happened or finally face it. But in that moment, I understood one thing. I couldn't pretend nothing had changed. I stood frozen, feeling the tension wrap around me. Thick, suffocating, inescapable, like waves rising in my chest, threatening to pull me under. His words still echoed in my head. But don't deny it. I swallowed hard, my fingers digging into the railing, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I swore he could hear it. I wanted to step back, to find a way out of this moment. But the scariest part was, I couldn't force myself to leave. The air between us felt thick, weighted, as if something unspoken but undeniable hung in the space, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Mr. Daniel's gaze held me in place, steady, patient, not pushing, not demanding, just waiting, as if he already knew that just a little more, and I would be the one to shatter my own defenses. My body was rigid, my mind spinning, overwhelmed by the flood of thoughts crashing into each other. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I can't. But my rational mind stood no chance against the wildfire of emotions raging inside me. I took in a shaky breath, desperate to regain control, but instead, I looked up at him. And in that moment, I knew I had lost. There was no escape, no logical excuse that could erase what I already understood. I felt it in my pulse. In the way my entire body shivered. In the unspoken hunger I had never dared to name before now. I couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't because he had pushed me. This wasn't because I had been led into something unknowingly. This was happening because I wanted it to. Are you scared? His voice was low, steady, carrying a quiet weight that made my chest tighten. I couldn't lie. I nodded. Slow, silent. Mr. Daniel didn't smirk, didn't tease, didn't take advantage of my hesitation. He simply stepped closer, his warmth melting the space between us. His presence looming, tangible, impossible to ignore. Being scared doesn't mean you don't want it. A shiver ran through me, but not from the cold. His eyes were gentle, but beneath that, there was something deeper, something unshakable, something that told me he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I swallowed hard, unable to look away from him. And in that second, every excuse, every justification, every fear I had collapsed in on itself. I felt myself leaning toward him, little by little, not because he was pulling me in, but because I wanted to move closer. And then, my lips met his, soft, hesitant, but real. His hand came up to my face, strong yet gentle, holding me there. And just like that, the world around us faded, shrinking until all that remained was his touch. His breath, the heavy drum of my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. The kiss was slow, deep, like testing the edge of something forbidden but too tempting to ignore. And when I finally pulled away, breathless, shaken, I knew I had stepped over a threshold I could never return from. Mr. Daniel didn't say anything at first, just brushed his fingers lightly over my cheek. His eyes unreadable but steady. Now you understand, don't you? I didn't answer. But we both knew. I already had. The kiss ended, but I remained there, breathing hard, my entire body buzzing with something I couldn't name. The air between us thickened again, like the moment had left a permanent mark, like the world had just shifted into something unfamiliar but inevitable. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. There was only silence, only his gaze, unwavering, waiting for me to fully accept what had just happened. I was shaking, though I didn't know if it was from the cold, the adrenaline, or something far deeper. I should have stepped back. I should have said something. But instead, I stood there, feeling the space between us still charged with everything we hadn't said out loud. Feeling his warmth, steady and unmoving, never forcing but never backing away. What the hell did I just do? I just kissed Jake's father. No, I just wanted to kiss him. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. Do you regret it? Mr. Daniel's voice was low, calm, but beneath it lay something dangerous, something unshakably certain. I looked at him, my mind spinning, desperately searching for an answer. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say this was a mistake, that this shouldn't have happened. But I couldn't lie, not when the feeling of his lips was still burning on mine. Not when every nerve in my body still trembled from it. I parted my lips, but no words came out. Mr. Daniel held my gaze for a long moment, then smirked faintly, as if he had known my answer before I did. You don't have to say anything. I bit my lip, my thoughts spiraling, wanting to break free from his stare, but somehow, unable to move away. The air was still too thick, too charged, too heavy with everything left unsaid. And then, the crunch of tires on gravel. I flinched, turning sharply, my heart slamming into my throat. Jake was back. Reality crashed over me, swallowing me whole, drowning me in a sea of conflict and chaos. I took a step back, trying to steady my breath, trying to force myself to return to normal. But I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. Because it had, and it had changed everything. Jake hopped out of his car, waving casually, completely oblivious to what had unfolded just minutes ago. Everything's fine now. I made it back just in time for dinner. Huh? His voice was light, carefree, clueless to the fact that I had just kissed his father. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. But I forced a laugh, nodded, answering on autopilot. Yeah, everything's fine. But when I glanced toward Mr. Daniel, his eyes were still on me, steady, unwavering, unapologetic. And in that instant, I knew, this wasn't over. It had only just begun. Dinner felt normal. Or at least, it was supposed to. Jake chatted about his shift at the store, cracking jokes, teasing me for making him do all the cooking. I laughed when I needed to, responded when expected, but every time I lifted my gaze, I met his eyes, Mr. Daniel's eyes. And they hadn't changed. They weren't impatient, weren't demanding, but they weren't avoiding me either. Every time I thought I could convince myself that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment. A mistake, something I could forget, his gaze pulled me back to the truth. The truth that I had kissed him. The truth that I had wanted to. And worst of all, I didn't regret it. At that moment, Jake clapped a hand on my shoulder, snapping me out of the whirlpool of thoughts consuming me. Dude, you okay? You look kinda out of it. I jerked slightly, forcing myself to sound normal. Yeah, I'm fine, just tired. Jake nodded, not thinking twice about it. But when I glanced across the table, Mr. Daniel was still watching me. A faint smirk barely touching his lips. A smirk full of meaning. And I knew I couldn't go back to how things were before. Because this was only the beginning.